Hello everyone, I am the boring historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The rising sun cast long shadows across the hills of Latium, as Marcus Valerius Aquila stood at the edge of his father's farm, gazing northward toward the distant silhouette of Rome. At 17, his lean frame had already been hardened by years of labor in the fields, his skin bronzed by the Italian sun. His father, a veteran who had served 16 years in Legio Tudet Augusta during the reign of the divine Augustus, had filled his childhood with tales of glory, discipline, and brotherhood. Now, with Emperor Trajan strengthening Rome's borders and expanding her territories, the call of the legions pulled at Marcus with an irresistible force. "You stare at the horizon as if it might reveal your future," came his father's voice from behind. Lucius Valerius approached with the slight limp that remained from a Germanic spear that had found its mark at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. He had been one of the few survivors of that bloody disaster, saved by his centurion and carried for miles through hostile territory before reaching safety. "I've made my decision, father," Marcus said, turning to face the weathered veteran. "I leave for Rome tomorrow to enlist." Lucius studied his son's face, seeing in it the same determination that had once driven him to the standards of Rome. He nodded slowly, placing a calloused hand on Marcus's shoulder. "The Legion is not what young men imagine," he said, his voice low and grave. "It is not glory, it is mud and blood, and the stink of men packed too closely together. It is discipline so harsh it breaks many. It is marching until your feet bleed, then marching further still. It is hunger and thirst and pain." He paused, his eyes distant with memories. "But it is also the closest brotherhood you will ever know, men who will die for you without hesitation as you will for them." Marcus nodded, having heard variations of this speech since childhood. "I understand, father." "No," Lucius said sharply. "You do not, but you will." His expression softened slightly. "Come, your mother has prepared a special meal, and there are things you must know before you stand before the recruitment officer." That night, as the family gathered around the hearth, Lucius recounted not tales of glory, but practical wisdom. He spoke of how to avoid the attention of cruel centurions, how to care for one's feet on long marches, how to find moments of rest in the chaos of camp life. He spoke of the gods a legionary should honor and the signs to watch for in battle. Marcus's mother, Livia, said little, but her eyes never left her son's face, as if memorizing it. When dawn came, Marcus embraced his parents. His mother pressed a small wooden amulet into his palm, a carving of Mars, god of war. "Return to us," she whispered, "whether in 16 years or when you are old and gray." Marcus nodded, tucking the amulet into his tunic, and set off down the dusty road toward Rome and his destiny. The recruitment center in Rome teemed with young men from across Italia and beyond. Some were volunteers like Marcus, driven by dreams of glory or the promise of regular pay. Others were there by necessity. Younger sons with no inheritance, debtors seeking escape from their creditors, or men simply desperate for the security of regular meals. A wizened recruitment officer sat at a table beneath a faded military standard, flanked by two veteran legionaries, whose scarred faces and impassive eyes had seen more of war than any of the young recruits could imagine. The line moved slowly, each potential soldier examined, questioned, and either accepted or dismissed. When Marcus's turn came, the officer looked him up and down with practiced efficiency. "Name and place of birth?" the officer asked, his stylus poised over a wax tablet. "Marcus Valerius Aquila, from a farm near Tibur," Marcus replied, standing as tall as his frame would allow. Age? 17. Any military experience in your family? My father served 16 years in Legio Tech Augusta under the Divine Augustus. This drew a slight nod of approval. The officer gestured to a nearby measuring post. Stand there, Marcus complied, and the officer noted his height, just over the minimum requirement of 5 Roman feet and 7 digits. Next came a physical examination, with the officer checking his teeth, eyesight, and the strength of his arms and legs. Strip, the officer commanded. Marcus removed his tunic, standing naked before the scrutiny of the veterans. They checked for any deformities or signs of disease, making him perform simple exercises to demonstrate his agility and strength. You're fit enough, the officer concluded. Can you read and write? Yes, sir. My father ensured it. Another nod. That's good. It will serve you well. The officer made another notation. You understand the terms? 16 years of service to Rome. You'll receive your first payment after taking the oath, 300 denarii, though most of that will go toward your equipment. Thereafter, you'll be paid 300 denarii annually, minus deductions for food, clothing, and equipment replacements. I understand, sir. The Legion offers security, but make no mistake, you're signing away 16 years of your life to Rome. There is no release before your time is served, except through death or crippling injury. Do you still wish to enlist? Marcus met the officer's gaze steadily. I do, sir. Very well. The officer handed him a wooden tablet. Report to the training camp outside the city tomorrow at dawn. Present this to the centurion on duty. Now go, there are many more to process. As Marcus stepped away, he overheard the officer's verdict to one of the veterans. Farm boy. Strong enough. He'll either break in the first month or make a decent soldier. Outside the recruitment center, Marcus found himself surrounded by other accepted recruits. Some were celebrating, already spending imaginary future wages on wine and women. Others were quieter, perhaps contemplating the enormity of the commitment they had just made. Marcus fell in with a group heading toward a tavern. First rounds on me, announced a burly youth named Titus, who claimed to be the son of a blacksmith from Capua. Might as well enjoy our last night of freedom. The tavern was crowded and smoky, filled with civilians, off-duty soldiers, and other recruits. Marcus sipped his wine slowly, listening to the boasts and fears of his future comrades. Some spoke of the wealth they would accumulate from plunder, others of the foreign women they would bed, still others of the glory they would win in battle. An older man at a nearby table, his weathered face marked by a prominent scar that ran from temple to jaw, watched them with barely concealed amusement. When Titus began a particularly outlandish tale of how he would single-handedly defeat a dozen barbarians, the scarred man let out a short, barking laugh. Something funny, old man? Titus challenged, his face flushing. You lot, the man replied, taking a deep draught of his wine. Green as spring grass and twice as tender, I've seen your kind come and go for 20 years. And who might you be? Another recruit demanded. Gaius Petronius, the man said simply. Optio of the 3rd cohort, Legio Ex Fretensis, recently retired after 25 years under the Eagles. The table fell silent. 25 years was a rare achievement, marking this man as one who had survived campaigns that had killed many others. Tell us then, Marcus said, leaning forward. What should we expect if you're so wise? Petronius studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod as if approving of the question. Expect to be broken down to nothing, then rebuilt as a Roman soldier. Expect to march until your feet are raw meat, then march another 10 miles. Expect to dig ditches, build roads, and construct bridges until your hands bleed. Expect to eat the same tasteless porridge day after day, to sleep on hard ground more often than not, to go weeks without bathing properly. He took another drink. Expect to follow orders without question, even when those orders seem senseless or suicidal. That's not so different from farm work, Marcus observed. Perhaps, Petronius conceded. But also expect to see men you've lived beside for years cut down in an instant. Expect to kill men who have done nothing to you personally, except to stand on the wrong side of a battle line. Expect to wake in the night years from now, still hearing their screams. A heavy silence fell over the table. "Why did you stay so long then?" asked one of the quieter recruits. "If it was so terrible?" Petronius's scarred face softened slightly. "Because there's nothing like it in the world," he said, his voice quieter now. "The bond between men who have faced death together. The pride of standing in that line, shoulder to shoulder, knowing you are part of something greater than yourself. The knowledge that you personally, stand between Rome and chaos." He drained his cup. "For all its hardships, I would not trade my years under the eagle for anything." He stood, placing a few coins on the table. "Dawn comes early, boys. You'd best get some sleep while you can still choose when to do so." With that, he departed, leaving the recruits in thoughtful silence. Later, as Marcus made his way to the modest inn where he had taken a room for the night, he pondered Petronius's words. The man had confirmed much of what his father had told him. Yet there had been something in the veteran's eyes when he spoke of the brotherhood of the legions. A fierce pride and nostalgia that told Marcus more than the words themselves. In his small room, Marcus took out the wooden amulet his mother had given him and placed it carefully beside his pallet. Tomorrow, he would begin his journey as a legionary. Tonight would be his last as a civilian, his last night of freedom for 16 years, if the gods granted him life enough to complete his service. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of marching men, clashing steel, and eagles soaring above distant battlefields. Dawn had barely broken when Marcus arrived at the training camp, a sprawling compound of wooden barracks, training grounds, and administrative buildings, surrounded by a simple wooden palisade. Already, hundreds of recruits were gathering, their breath fogging in the cool morning air. Centurions and other officers moved among them, shouting orders and organizing the new arrivals into rough groups. A grizzled centurion with a face like weathered leather checked Marcus's recruitment tablet and directed him to join a group of 30 other recruits. 10th Contubernium, 4th Century, 2nd Cohort, the centurion barked. "Move." Marcus hurried to join the indicated group, finding himself standing beside a wiry youth with dark eyes who introduced himself as Gaius Tullius from Neapolis. Before they could exchange more than names, a stocky Optio approached their group, his vine stick, the symbol of his authority to discipline, held casually in one hand. "Silence!" the Optio roared, and the murmuring recruits fell instantly quiet. "I am Optio Severus. For the next 4 months, I own you. You are not men. You are not even dogs. You are nothing until I decide you are worthy to be called Roman legionaries." He paced before them, his hard eyes examining each recruit in turn. "Look to your left. Look to your right. One of those men will likely not complete training. The weak will be culled, the lazy will be broken. Only those with the discipline and strength to serve Rome will remain." The Optio pointed to a pile of equipment nearby. "Each of you will be issued a tunic, a cloak, a pair of caligae, and basic training equipment. You will maintain these items as if your lives depend on them, because one day they will. You will learn to march, to fight, to obey without question or hesitation. You will learn to function not as individuals, but as parts of a whole, a century, a cohort, a legion." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The first lesson begins now. You have exactly 1 hour to collect your equipment, find your assigned barracks, stow your gear according to regulations. and assemble on the training ground in full kit. Begin. What followed was chaos as recruits scrambled to claim their equipment and locate their assigned quarters. Marcus found himself in a long, narrow barracks building divided into sections, each designed to house 8 men. A contubernium, the smallest unit of the Legion. His 7 barracks mates were a diverse group. Gaius from Neapolis, Titus the blacksmith's son, Lucius, a farmer's son from Campania, Quintus, a quiet, educated youth from Rome itself, Drusus, a rough-looking character who claimed to have been a street fighter, Servius, a merchant's son from Ostia, and Numerius, a taciturn recruit who revealed little about his past. They had barely stowed their equipment when a horn sounded, signaling that their hour was nearly up. The 8 men rushed to don their training gear. Simple tunics, cloaks, and the distinctive caligae, the hobnailed military boots that would eventually carry them thousands of miles across the empire. On the training ground, the recruits were arranged in formation, standing at attention beneath the hot sun as centurions inspected their appearance and equipment. Many failed this first inspection, their tunics improperly belted or their caligae incorrectly laced. The punishment was immediate: 20 push-ups, followed by a sprint around the training ground. "This is how it begins," Gaius muttered to Marcus, as they watched several unfortunate recruits gasping in the dust. "They break us down to build us up." The day unfolded in a blur of activity. The recruits were taught the basics of standing at attention, marching in formation, and responding to simple commands. By midday, Marcus's legs ached and his throat burned with thirst. But there was no respite. After a brief meal of porridge and water, they were introduced to the training weapons. Wooden swords and shields heavier than the real equipment they would eventually carry, designed to build strength and endurance. "A legionary's primary weapon is not his gladius," announced their weapons instructor, a scarred veteran named Atticus. "It is not his pilum, it is discipline. Without discipline, you are not soldiers, you are merely armed men, no better than barbarians." Hour after hour, they practiced the basic movements: the thrust, the parry, the shield block. Atticus moved among them, correcting grips, adjusting stances, occasionally demonstrating a technique with a speed and precision that made the recruits gape in awe. By sunset, Marcus's arms trembled with exhaustion, and sweat had soaked through his tunic. When they were finally dismissed to the mess hall for the evening meal, he could barely lift his wooden cup of pasca, the sour wine and water mixture that was the standard drink of the legions. "I've never been so tired in my life," groaned Titus, slumping on the bench beside Marcus. "And this is only the first day." "It gets worse before it gets better," said a voice from the next table. A young legionary, perhaps a year into his service, was watching the recruits with a mixture of sympathy and amusement. "But you'll be surprised what you can endure." Back in the barracks, as they prepared for sleep, Quintus, the educated Roman, produced a small bronze statuette of Mars from his pack and placed it on a small shelf near his bed. "For protection," he explained, seeing the others watching, "and for strength in the days to come." One by one, the exhausted recruits settled onto their straw pallets. Marcus reached into his tunic and touched the wooden amulet his mother had given him, offering a silent prayer to Mars. As sleep claimed him, he wondered what the coming days would bring, and whether he would have the strength to endure them. The next day began before dawn, with Optio Severus storming into the barracks, beating a metal pot with his vine stick and bellowing for the recruits to assemble outside immediately. Bleary-eyed and stiff from the previous day's exertions, Marcus and his contubernium stumbled into formation in the pre-dawn chill, still fastening their tunics and adjusting their caligae. "Too slow," Severus roared. When I call, you move as one. Again, back to barracks. 3 more times, they were sent back to their barracks and ordered to reassemble, until finally they managed to form up in what the Opsho deemed an acceptable time. By then, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten. 10-mile march before breakfast, Severus announced with grim satisfaction. Perhaps that will teach you the value of promptness. The march was brutal. Carrying full packs and their heavy training weapons, the recruits struggled to maintain formation as they navigated the rough terrain surrounding the camp. Those who fell behind or broke formation were immediately punished with additional weights added to their packs. By the time they returned to camp, the sun was high, and many recruits were near collapse. "This is madness," gasped Drusus, as they finally sat down to a meager breakfast of porridge and hard bread. "No man can endure this." "That's the point," Quintus replied quietly. "They're not training men, they're training legionaries." The days that followed fell into a punishing rhythm. Every morning began with physical training, running, climbing, swimming, wrestling, designed to build strength and endurance. The afternoons were devoted to weapons training, with endless drills in the use of the gladius, pilum, and shield. Evenings brought lessons in camp construction, basic engineering, and the maintenance of equipment. Every aspect of their lives was regimented. They ate together, trained together, and learned to sleep in any conditions, often outdoors on the bare ground, sometimes in the rain, as they would need to do on campaign. They were taught to care for their feet, to identify and treat common ailments, to forage for supplemental food, and to cook simple meals from their rations. Discipline was harsh and immediate. Minor infractions, a poorly maintained weapon, a misaligned formation, a moment's inattention during instruction, were punished with physical exercises, extra duties, or reduction in rations. More serious offenses could result in flogging or even dismissal from the legion in disgrace. A week into training, Numerius, the taciturn recruit, was caught stealing food from the stores. The entire century was assembled to witness his punishment. 20 lashes with a flagrum, the multi-tailed whip whose leather thongs were weighted with metal. By the 10th stroke, Numerius was unconscious, his back a mass of bloody welts. He was revived with cold water and the remaining lashes administered. Afterward, he was assigned to the camp hospital, but it was clear he would bear the scars for life, both physical and those of shame. "Let this be a lesson," their centurion announced afterward. "In the Legion, theft is not merely a crime against your fellows, it is a crime against Rome herself. The punishment reflects the severity of the offense." As the weeks passed, the recruits' bodies transformed. Soft flesh hardened into muscle. Blisters became calluses. Sunburned skin darkened to a uniform bronze. They learned to march 20 miles in a day carrying 60 pounds of equipment, to construct a defensive camp before nightfall, to fight in various formations, and to respond instantly to commands without thought or question. But the training was as much mental as physical. They were being remade, their individual identities subordinated to the collective. They learned that survival depended not on individual strength or skill, but on functioning as part of a cohesive unit. In battle formations, each man's shield protected not himself primarily, but the man to his left. Each man depended on those around him, and they on him. Not all endured. Of the 30 recruits who had started in their century, 5 had already been dismissed, 3 due to injuries that would not heal properly, 1 who had broken under the psychological strain, and 1 who had simply disappeared in the night, a deserter who would face execution if caught. The remaining recruits drew closer together, forged by shared hardship into something resembling the brotherhood that Petronius had described. One evening, As Marcus's contubernum sat cleaning their equipment after a particularly grueling day of training, Servius, the merchant's son, spoke up unexpectedly. "My father wanted me to follow him into trade," he said, oiling the wooden practice sword that had become like an extension of his arm. "He offered me a position managing one of his warehouses in Ostia. I would have had my own house, slaves, a comfortable life." He paused, examining the edge of the blade. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." "Why did you enlist then?" asked Lucius, the farmer's son. Servius was quiet for a moment. "I saw a triumph when I was a boy," he finally said. "The legionaries marching through Rome, their armor gleaming in the sun, their standards held high, the crowd cheering, throwing flowers, the pride in their faces." He shrugged. "I wanted that, to be part of something great, something that would outlast me. I came for the regular pay," what admitted Drusus, the former street fighter. "And because it was either the Legion or prison after my last brawl in Rome." "My family has served for generations," said Lucius. "Father, grandfather, great-grandfather, all legionaries. It's expected." One by one they shared their reasons, some noble, some practical, all deeply personal. When it came to Marcus's turn, he considered mentioning his father's service, but found himself speaking a deeper truth. "I wanted to test myself," he said, "to discover what I'm truly capable of." He ran a hand along his practice shield, feeling the dents and scratches it had accumulated. "And I think I wanted to be worthy of Rome, to give something back to the empire that has given us so much." Quintus nodded slowly. "Worthy reasons," he said, "though I suspect we'll all find our true motivations tested before our 16 years are done." As they continued their work in companionable silence, Marcus reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The pain and exhaustion were still present, but he had begun to take pride in enduring them. The discipline that had once seemed arbitrary now revealed its purpose: to create soldiers who would stand firm when every instinct screamed to flee, who would function as a unit even in the chaos of battle. He was not yet a legionary, but he was becoming one, step by painful step, and looking at the determined faces of his comrades, he knew he was not alone on the journey. 3 months into training, the transformation of the recruits was remarkable. They moved as a unit, their formations tight and precise, their responses to commands immediate and unquestioning. They had mastered the basic weapons of the legionary, the gladius, the pilum, and the scutum, and had begun training in more advanced tactics and formations. The contubernum had become a tightly knit unit. Each man knew the strengths and weaknesses of his comrades, compensating for each other's shortcomings and building on collective strengths. They had learned to set up their 8-man tent in minutes, to cook and share their rations efficiently, and to care for each other's equipment when illness or injury struck one of their number. On a crisp autumn morning, Centurion Flavius, the commander of their century, assembled the recruits on the training ground. A tall, imposing figure with 20 years of service behind him, Flavius was respected and feared in equal measure. Unlike some officers who relied on brutality, he led through competence and unwavering adherence to standards. "You've been training with wooden weapons," he announced, pacing before the assembled recruits. "Today, that changes. You will be issued standard legionary equipment, real steel, not training tools. You will care for this equipment as if your lives depend on it, because they will." A murmur of excitement ran through the ranks. This was a significant milestone, an acknowledgement that they were progressing toward full legionary status. However, Flavius continued, silencing the whispers with a sharp look, "This is not a reward. It is a responsibility. Steel kills, steel maims. You will handle these weapons with the respect they deserve, or you will answer to me." One by one, the recruits were called forward to receive their equipment. A gladius in its scabbard, designed to hang on the right side for the drawing across motion that characterized Roman sword fighting. Two pila, the heavy javelins that were the legion's signature ranged weapons, and a scutum, the curved rectangular shield that protected the legionary and created the famous testudo formation when combined with others. Additionally, each man received a pugio, dagger, a military belt, a bronze helmet, and a set of body armor. In this case, the lorica hamada, a mail shirt that offered good protection while allowing freedom of movement. The full panoply of a legionary, minus a few items they would receive when assigned to their permanent legion. Tomorrow, Flavius announced as the last recruit returned to formation with his new equipment. We begin field exercises. You will apply everything you have learned in conditions approximating actual combat. I expect nothing less than your absolute best. That evening, the barracks buzzed with excitement as the recruits examined their new equipment. Marcus ran his fingers over the hilt of his gladius, feeling the weight and balance of the weapon that would be his constant companion for the next 16 years. The blade was plain but functional, stamped with the mark of the Imperial Armory. "It's heavier than I expected," remarked Gaius, experimentally drawing his own sword. "It's meant for stabbing, not slashing," Quintus pointed out. "The weight helps with penetration, especially against armor." They spent hours cleaning and adjusting their equipment, ensuring that straps fit properly and that all metal surfaces were oiled against rust. As they worked, veterans circulated through the barracks, offering advice and sharing tales of how proper equipment maintenance had saved lives in battle. "Your shield is your best friend," advised one scarred opsho. "Keep the facing tight and waterproofed. In the heat of battle, you won't have time to worry about whether your grip is slipping or if the wood is warping from moisture." The next day, as promised, they began field exercises in earnest. Where before they had practiced formations and maneuvers on the training ground, now they were taken into varied terrain, forests, hills, streams, and made to apply their skills in realistic conditions. They learned to cross rivers while maintaining formation, to navigate dense woodland without losing cohesion, to establish defensive positions in adverse conditions. They practiced the testudo, or tortoise formation, linking their shields to create a protective shell against simulated arrow fire. They conducted forced marches, sometimes at night, learning to trust their training when visibility was poor. Most importantly, they began to engage in mock battles against other centuries, using wooden swords attached to their real weapons for safety. These exercises were as close to actual combat as possible, without risking serious injury, with veterans acting as enemy forces, employing various tactics to test the recruits' responses. One such exercise took place in a wooded valley, with Marcus's century tasked with defending a small bridge against a Germanic raiding party. Composed of veterans, the century took up positions according to their training, with the front ranks forming a shield wall while the rear ranks prepared their pila. The enemy emerged from the trees with a thunderous war cry, charging toward the Roman position. On command, the rear ranks launched their practice pila, wooden shafts weighted to simulate the real weapons. Then the front ranks braced for impact as the veterans crashed against their shield wall. The clash was chaotic and violent, even with training weapons. Men grunted and shouted, shields slammed against each other, and the wooden swords dealt painful blows to those who left openings in their defense. Marcus found himself face to face with a scarred veteran who drove forward with terrifying strength, seeking to break through the line. Remembering his training, Marcus kept his shield firm, angled to deflect the force rather than meet it head-on. He stabbed with his wooden sword at the veteran's exposed leg, earning a grunt of approval even as the man twisted away from the strike. "Good," the veteran called, even as he continued his assault. "Use the shield. Don't just hold it. Fight with it." Beside Marcus, Titus was struggling against another attacker. Without breaking his own engagement, Marcus shifted slightly, allowing his shield to partially cover Titus's exposed flank. This mutual support was the essence of Roman tactics, not individual heroics, but coordinated action. For nearly an hour, the battle ebbed and flowed, with the veterans employing various tactics to test the recruits' discipline and adaptability. By the end, both sides were exhausted, but the recruits had held their position as ordered. "Not entirely terrible," announced Centurion Flavius, which from him constituted high praise. "You maintained formation under pressure. You supported each other. You followed commands even in confusion." He paused, his stern gaze sweeping the tired recruits. "But in a real battle, at least a third of you would be dead or wounded from the mistakes I observed. We'll address those errors tomorrow." That night, as they tended their bruises and compared notes on the exercise, a messenger arrived at the barracks with news that sent a ripple of excitement through the recruits. The following week, they would participate in a full Legion exercise. Thousands of men maneuvering together on open ground, simulating a major battle. It would be their first taste of the scale and complexity of legionary warfare. "This is it," Gaius said, eyes bright with anticipation. "This is what we've been training for." Marcus nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The exercise would be the culmination of their training, a test of everything they had learned. Success would bring them one step closer to assignment to a real legion and deployment to the frontiers of the Empire. Failure would mean more training, more drills, and a damaged reputation before they had even begun their true service. As he checked his equipment one final time before sleep, Marcus reflected on how far they had come and how far they still had to go. They were no longer civilians playing at being soldiers. They were becoming legionaries, forged in the harsh discipline of Roman military training. Whether they would prove worthy of that title remained to be seen. The morning of the Legion exercise dawned clear and cold, with a crispness in the air that spoke of the approaching winter. Marcus and his contubernium rose before first light, donning their full equipment with practiced efficiency. There was little conversation. Each man was focused on the day ahead, mentally reviewing formations and commands. They assembled with the rest of their century in the pre-dawn gloom, standing at attention as Centurion Flavius conducted a thorough inspection. Today, more than ever, every detail mattered. A loose strap or improperly secured piece of equipment could compromise not just the individual, but the entire unit. "Today you will be observed by Legion commanders," Flavius informed them, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "They will be deciding which recruits are ready for assignment to active legions. Some of you will be deemed worthy, others will require further training." He paused, his gaze sweeping the ranks. "Remember your training. Remember your discipline. Remember that you represent not just yourselves, but Rome herself." With a sharp command, he ordered the century into marching formation. As one, they turned and began the journey to the massive training field where the exercise would take place, their cadenced steps echoing in the quiet morning. The sight that greeted them as they crested a hill overlooking the field was breathtaking. Thousands of men were assembling on the plain below, cohorts forming into legions, cavalry units taking up positions on the flanks, artillery units preparing their scorpions and ballistas. Standards gleamed in the early sunlight, Centurions shouted orders, and the air thrummed with the energy of Rome's military might. "Gods above," breathed Titus beside Marcus. "I never imagined." "This is just a fraction of Rome's strength," Quintus reminded him. "A single legion of many." Their century was assigned to the fourth cohort of what was designated the Eastern Legion for the purposes of the exercise. The opposing force, the Western Legion, was already forming up across the field. Both sides were composed of a mixture of recruits and veterans, ensuring that inexperienced men would be bolstered by those who had seen actual combat. As they took their position in the battle line, Marcus found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with men he had never met before, from different training centuries and cohorts. Yet there was an immediate sense of unity. They were all legionaries, all serving under the same eagles, all trained in the same tactics and discipline. From a raised platform at the center of the field, a senior legate, a legion commander, addressed the assembled forces, his voice carried by a system of subordinates who repeated his words down the line. Today's exercise simulates a pitched battle between Roman forces and a coalition of Germanic tribes. The instructions filtered down. The Western Legion will employ tactics typical of our northern enemies. Initial skirmishing followed by massed charges aimed at breaking our lines. The Eastern Legion will respond with standard Roman tactics, maintaining discipline and formation while exploiting the enemy's lack of organization. Further instructions followed, outlining the specific objectives each side was to pursue and the signals that would indicate various phases of the battle. Though the weapons were blunted for safety, the exercise would be conducted with deadly seriousness, an opportunity to practice the maneuvers and responses that would determine victory or defeat in actual combat. A trumpet blast signaled the beginning of the exercise. Immediately, light troops from the Western Legion advanced, simulating the skirmishers that typically preceded barbarian armies. They hurled practice javelins and sling stones, testing the Eastern Legion's discipline under fire. Marcus raised his shield as a blunted javelin thudded against it, the impact traveling up his arm despite the shield's protection. Around him, other legionaries did the same, maintaining their formation despite the barrage. On command, their own light troops advanced, trading missiles with the enemy skirmishers, while the main battle line remained steady. This phase continued for nearly half an hour, simulating the probing actions that typically preceded major engagements. Then came the main attack. With a coordinated war cry that sent chills down Marcus's spine, the Western Legion's front cohorts surged forward in a simulated barbarian charge, seeking to overwhelm the Eastern Legion through sheer momentum and ferocity. "Hold!" bellowed their centurion as the enemy approached. "Hold formation!" The discipline of the Eastern Legion held firm. As the charging troops came within range, the command rang out, "Pila!" As one, the front ranks hurled their practiced pila into the oncoming attackers. In a real battle, these heavy javelins would impale men or lodge in shields, weighing them down and creating gaps in the enemy formation. Even in exercise, the effect was dramatic, disrupting the Western Legion's charge and creating momentary confusion. "Draw swords," came the next command. Marcus and his comrades drew their wooden practice swords in the practiced motion they had drilled hundreds of times. "Shield wall." The shields locked together, each man's shield protecting his own left side and the right side of his neighbor. This was the foundation of Roman infantry tactics, an unbroken wall of shields from behind, which the short, stabbing gladius could strike with deadly effect. The impact when the Western Legion hit their line was tremendous. Marcus felt his feet slide backward several inches despite his braced stance, and his shield arm ached with the strain of absorbing the collision. but the line held, and immediately the counterattack began. "Push!" roared the centurion. "Strike! Push!" The rhythm of Roman infantry combat took over, a synchronized pushing with shields to create openings, followed by short, powerful stabs with the practiced swords, targeting the abdomen or groin where real strikes would be most effective. It was methodical, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. For what seemed like hours, the battle swayed back and forth across the field. Units rotated from front line to reserve and back again, simulating the relief system that allowed Roman armies to maintain pressure while giving tired troops a chance to recover. Trumpets and standards communicated complex maneuvers across the vast battlefield, coordinating the movements of thousands of men. Marcus lost track of time, focused entirely on the immediate tasks of maintaining formation, protecting his comrades, and executing the combat techniques that had been drilled into muscle memory. His world narrowed to the few feet around him, the shields to either side, the enemies before him, the commands of his officers. A horn blast signaled a change in tactics. The Eastern Legion was to execute a complex maneuver, a controlled withdrawal in the center to draw the enemy forward, while the wings held firm, creating a pocket into which the Western Legion would be drawn. The difficulty of such a maneuver was immense. It required each man to step backward in perfect coordination while maintaining the shield wall. Too fast, and the line would break. Too slow, and the trap would be obvious. It required absolute trust in one's comrades and officers. To Marcus's amazement, the maneuver worked nearly perfectly. The center withdrew step by disciplined step, while the wings held firm. The Western Legion, sensing an opportunity, pressed forward into the developing pocket. When they were fully committed, a trumpet blast signaled the springing of the trap. Reserve cohorts that had been held back now swept forward, striking the exposed flanks of the Western Legion's advance. Simultaneously, the withdrawing center halted its retreat and pushed forward again, catching the enemy in a three-sided trap. In a real battle, this would have been the decisive moment, the point at which an enemy force would break and flee, to be cut down by pursuing cavalry. In the exercise, another horn blast signaled the end of the main engagement. The Western Legion acknowledged the tactical defeat, withdrawing in good order to regroup for the next phase of the exercise. As they caught their breath during the brief respite, Marcus realized he was drenched in sweat despite the cool day. His arms ached, his legs trembled with fatigue, and his throat was parched with thirst. Yet there was also an exhilaration unlike anything he had experienced before. The satisfaction of participating in a complex military maneuver executed to near perfection. Water. Gaius croaked beside him, passing a skin. "Drink while you can." Marcus took a grateful swallow, then passed the skin to Titus. Around them, other legionaries were doing the same, sharing water and brief words of encouragement or advice. Centurions moved among the ranks, offering terse praise or correction based on what they had observed. "Your section held well during the withdrawal," Optio Severus told their contubernium, his usual harshness tempered by a hint of approval. "But you, Drusus, you were a half-step slow on the pivot. In real combat, that creates a gap a German could put his axe through." The exercise continued throughout the day, with various scenarios testing different aspects of Legion tactics, defending against cavalry, responding to flank attacks, executing complex formations like the wedge and the orb. By late afternoon, both legions were exhausted but satisfied with their performance. As the sun began to set, the legate who had started the exercise called for the final assembly. The thousands of participants formed up in their cohorts, standing at attention despite their fatigue as he addressed them. Today, you have demonstrated the discipline and adaptability that make the legions of Rome the finest fighting force in the world, the legate announced, his voice carried across the field by his subordinates. Some of you are recruits, experiencing for the first time the scale and complexity of legion warfare. Others are veterans, whose experience guides and steadies those newer to our ranks. Together, you embody the strength of Rome. Not individual prowess, but collective might, directed by discipline and training. He paused, surveying the assembled men with evident pride. Those recruits who have proven themselves ready will receive their assignments within the week. You will join active legions across the empire, from Britannia to Syria, from the Rhine to the Nile. You will carry the eagle of Rome to the furthest reaches of the civilized world and beyond. Remember this day, and remember always that you are legionaries of Rome, the sword and shield of civilization itself. A cheer went up from the assembled troops, a sound like thunder rolling across the plain. Marcus found himself joining in, his voice merging with thousands of others in a moment of shared pride and purpose. As they marched back to camp in the gathering darkness, there was a new spring in their step, despite the day's exertions. They had been tested as a legion and had proven worthy. Now they awaited the next step in their journey, assignment to the frontiers of the empire, where they would face real enemies rather than fellow Romans in training exercises. "Where do you think they'll send us?" Titus asked as they cleaned their equipment that evening, checking for damage and wear after the day's activities. "The Rhine frontier, I hope," replied Drusus. "That's where the glory is, fighting Germans." "Glory gets you killed," Lucius observed dryly. "I'd prefer the eastern provinces. Warmer climate, better food, more civilized locals. You don't join the legion for comfort," Quintus pointed out. "Besides, the Parthians are as dangerous as any German tribe." Marcus listened to the speculation without joining in. He had no preference for assignment. Wherever Rome needed him, he would go. That was the oath he had taken, the commitment he had made. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held, what distant lands he might see, what battles he might fight in service to the empire. 3 days later, the assignments came. Their centurion assembled the century and read out the postings from a wax tablet. Different groups were bound for different legions, some to Legio Sexth Augusta in Britannia, others to Legio XII Fulminata in Cappadocia, still others to various legions along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. When he reached Marcus's contubernum, the centurion paused. "You 8 will join Legio Anx Fretensis, currently stationed in Judea under the governor Tiberius Julius Alexander. You depart in 3 days for Ostia, where you will board a vessel bound for Caesarea Maritima." A murmur ran through the contubernum. Judea, a troublesome province on the eastern frontier, prone to rebellion and unrest. Not the most prestigious posting, but not the worst either. At least they would stay together as a unit, which was not always the case with new assignments. Judea, Gaius mused later as they prepared for their final days in the training camp. Land of 1,000 gods and fanatics for every one of them. One god, actually, Quintus corrected. The Jews worship a single deity. No images, no sacrifices except at their great temple in Jerusalem. Very strange people. "All I care about is whether they fight," said Drusus with characteristic bluntness. "I didn't train this hard to spend 16 years policing streets and collecting taxes." Marcus said nothing, but he shared some of Drusus's sentiment. They had been trained for war, for the clash of armies on open fields. The thought of urban peacekeeping duty was less appealing, though he would do his duty regardless. The final days in camp passed quickly, filled with administrative tasks and preparations for departure. They were issued their final pieces of equipment, including their legionary decorations. the falere, metal discs, and torques that would mark them as full legionaries rather than recruits. Each man received a small advance on his pay to cover expenses during the journey, with the remainder to be paid upon reaching their new legion. On their last night in camp, Centurion Flavius surprised them by organizing a modest feast for the departing recruits. By legion standards, it was luxurious. Fresh bread instead of hardtack, roasted meat instead of the usual porridge, and wine that wasn't watered down to mere tastelessness. Consider this your introduction to the Brotherhood of the Legions, Flavius told them, unusually relaxed for once. From tomorrow, you are no longer my responsibility. You belong to your new centurions, your new legion. But you will always be legionaries, and that bond transcends individual units or postings. He raised his cup in a toast. To Rome, whom we serve, to the Emperor, whom we obey, and to each other, upon whom we depend. The recruits echoed the toast, drinking deeply. As the evening wore on, veterans shared stories of distant postings and battles long past. They spoke of the hardships and dangers, but also of the camaraderie, the shared experiences that could never be explained to civilians. Later, as Marcus prepared for his final night in the training barracks, he found Optio Severus waiting near his bunk. Aquila, the Optio said, using Marcus's family name for the first time. A word. Marcus stood at attention, uncertain what to expect. Severus had been a harsh taskmaster throughout their training, driving them relentlessly and accepting nothing short of excellence. At ease, Severus said, his voice unusually quiet. I've watched you these past months. You have the makings of a good legionary, perhaps more. Marcus blinked in surprise at the unexpected praise. Thank you, Optio. Don't thank me yet, Severus replied with a hint of his usual gruffness. Judea is not an easy posting. The Jews are a proud people, resentful of Roman rule. There are zealots who would gladly die to kill a single legionary. You'll need all your training and more. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Watch and learn from the veterans. Trust your centurion. And remember, in the provinces, you are Rome. How you conduct yourself reflects on the empire itself. With that cryptic advice, he departed, leaving Marcus to ponder his words as he prepared for the journey ahead. The next morning, as dawn broke over the camp, Marcus and his comrades assembled one final time in their training century. They had arrived as civilians months before, soft, undisciplined individuals. They departed as legionaries, hardened, disciplined, parts of a greater whole. Whatever awaited them in distant Judea, they would face it together, bearing the eagle of Rome to the eastern frontier of the empire. The journey to Ostia, Rome's principal port, took 3 days of steady marching. Marcus and his contubernium traveled as part of a larger detachment of newly assigned legionaries, all bound for eastern postings. Though they no longer had instructors hovering over their every move, discipline remained strict. They marched in formation, established proper camps each night, and maintained their equipment with the same care they had been taught during training. For Marcus, the march was his first real glimpse of the Italian countryside beyond the immediate vicinity of Rome and his home region. They passed through prosperous farmlands and vineyards, small towns and villages where locals watched the passing soldiers with a mixture of pride and wariness. Everywhere, the presence of Rome was evident. In the straight, paved roads they marched upon, in the aqueducts that supplied distant cities with water, in the uniform standards of weights and measures used in the marketplaces. This is what we protect, Quintus observed one evening as they looked down from their hillside camp at a town nestled in the valley below, its forum and temples gleaming in the setting sun. Not just Rome herself, but all of this: civilization, order, prosperity. Tell that to the Germans and Parthians, Drusus replied with a snort. I doubt they see us as protectors. That's because they're barbarians, Titus interjected. They don't understand what Rome offers. Rome offers the choice between submission and annihilation, Gaius said quietly. It's not surprising some choose to resist. Careful, warned Lucius, glancing around to ensure no officers were within earshot. That kind of talk sounds dangerously close to sympathy for enemies of the Empire. Gaius shrugged. Understanding your enemy doesn't mean sympathizing with him. It means defeating him more effectively. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Marcus found himself pondering Gaius's words. He had been raised to believe in Rome's civilizing mission, in the Pax Romana that brought peace and prosperity to conquered lands. Yet he was not so naive as to believe that Roman rule was always welcomed by those who found themselves beneath its heel. These philosophical musings were forgotten the next day when they crested a hill and saw for the first time the Mediterranean spreading before them, a vast expanse of blue stretching to the horizon. And there, at the mouth of the Tiber, lay Ostia, its harbor crowded with ships from every corner of the empire. Mare Nostrum, Quintus said softly beside him. Our sea, that's what we call it, because Rome controls every shore it touches. Their entrance into Ostia was marked by the curious stares of civilians and the more knowing glances of other soldiers. The port city was a bustling hub of commerce and travel, its streets crowded with merchants, sailors, travelers, and the countless slaves who performed the labor that kept this vital link in Rome's commercial network functioning. They were directed to a military compound near the harbor where they would await their ship. Hundreds of legionaries were already there, some, like them, newly assigned to Eastern legions. Others veterans returning from leave, still others transferring between postings. Despite the diversity of origins and destinations, there was an immediate sense of fellowship. They were all legionaries, all sworn to the same eagles, all part of the vast military machine that secured Rome's dominance. 2 days until our ship sails, their escort centurion informed them after consulting with the harbor master. You'll be quartered here until then. Standard camp discipline applies. The city is not off limits, but conduct yourselves as befits legionaries. Any man who brings disgrace upon the eagles will answer to me before facing formal discipline. With these ominous words, they were dismissed to settle into their temporary quarters. The prospect of 2 days in a port city was enticing after months of rigorous training. Ostia offered entertainments of all kinds: taverns, bathhouses, brothels, markets selling exotic goods from across the empire. For young men who had been under constant supervision and strict discipline, the temptations were considerable. I'm for the baths, then a decent meal that isn't army porridge, announced Titus once they had stowed their equipment. Who's with me? Most of the contubernium agreed enthusiastically, though Quintus elected to visit a bookshop he had heard of instead. Marcus decided to accompany the main group, curious to experience more of the port city. The public baths were a welcome luxury after months where bathing had been a hasty, functional affair. They progressed through the traditional sequence: the tepidarium with its warm, humid air, the caldarium with its hot pools, and finally the frigidarium with its bracing cold plunge. Clean and refreshed, they donned their tunics, leaving their military equipment secured in their quarters as regulations required when off-duty in friendly territory. Afterward, they found a tavern that catered to soldiers, its walls decorated with fading paintings of military campaigns, and its proprietor a veteran who greeted them with knowing camaraderie. Newly minted legionaries, eh? He observed, serving them wine that was superior to the pasca they were accustomed to. I can always tell. Not as cocky as the veterans, not as green as the raw recruits. Let me guess, Eastern postings? Legio Kex Fretensis, Gaius confirmed. Judea. The tavern keeper's expression sobered slightly. Tricky posting that. The Jews are a peculiar people, stubborn as mules about their customs and their one God. Keep your wits about you there, lads. He was not the last to offer such warnings. Throughout the evening, as they enjoyed their rare leisure, they encountered other soldiers with experience in the eastern provinces. All spoke of Judea with a mixture of respect and wariness. The countryside's not so bad, one veteran of the Syrian legions told them. Fertile enough, if not as lush as Italia. Good wine in some regions. But the cities... He shook his head. Jerusalem's the worst. Packed with religious fanatics who consider our very presence a defilement of their sacred spaces. Are they dangerous? Asked Servius, the quietest member of their contubernium. Not in open battle, the veteran replied. They've no discipline, no real military training. But they're masters of the knife in the dark, the stone thrown from a rooftop, the poison slipped into a cup. And they believe their God rewards martyrdom, which makes them fearless in a way that's unsettling. As the evening progressed, the conversation turned to more immediate concerns. The sea voyage ahead. None of Marcus's contubernium had significant experience with sea travel. The Mediterranean in autumn could be treacherous, with sudden storms that claimed many ships each year. The captain of your vessel will be watching the sky like a hawk, assured an older legionary who had made the crossing several times. They don't sail if the omens are bad. Better a delay than the bottom of the sea. How long is the journey? Marcus asked. To Caesarea, with favorable winds, perhaps 20 days. With unfavorable ones, he shrugged. You might be afloat for twice that. Brings a new meaning to the term sea legs. Later, as they made their way back to their quarters through Ostia's torchlit streets, Marcus found himself walking beside Gaius, who had been unusually quiet throughout the evening. Troubled thoughts? Marcus inquired. Gaius glanced at him, then gazed up at the star-filled sky. My father was a sailor, he said after a moment. His ship was lost in a storm off Cyprus when I was 10. The sea has made widows in my family for generations. Marcus placed a hand on his comrade's shoulder. We'll make the crossing safely, he said with more confidence than he felt. The gods watch over legionaries. Gaius smiled faintly. Let's hope they're not too busy watching over the Germans and Parthians as well. The next day, they explored more of Ostia, marveling at the variety of goods flowing through the port. Spices from Arabia, textiles from Egypt, amber from the Baltic, slaves from Thrace and Nubia. The empire's reach was on display in every marketplace and warehouse, a testament to Roman dominance of the known world. In the afternoon, they visited their ship, a substantial merchant vessel requisitioned for military transport. The captain, a weathered Greek named Demetrios, greeted them with the casual disdain sailors often reserved for soldiers. You'll stay out of my crew's way, he informed them bluntly. The sea doesn't care that you're legionaries. One wrong move on a pitching deck can send a man overboard, and I won't turn back for him. They inspected the areas designated for their use. A section of the hold equipped with simple hammocks and storage for their equipment. It would be cramped, uncomfortable, and likely foul-smelling after a few days at sea. But it was transportation, not luxury, that Rome provided its legionaries. That evening, their final one in Italia, the contubernium gathered on a hilltop overlooking the harbor. The sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, and the lamps of the city were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. This time tomorrow, we'll be out of sight of land, Lucius said, a hint of wonder in his voice. Further from home than any of us has ever been. And getting further with each day, added Servius softly. They sat in companionable silence for a time. each lost in his own thoughts about the journey ahead and the home left behind. Though none spoke of it, there was a shared awareness that some of them might never see Italia again. The life of a legionary was dangerous, and 16 years was a long time to tempt fate. A libation, Quintus suggested, producing a small flask of wine he had purchased earlier. To Neptune for safe passage. They took turns pouring small offerings onto the ground and sipping from the flask. When it came to Marcus, he raised it high. To Neptune for our journey, he said, to Mars for our battles to come, and to Rome, whom we serve in distant lands. Dawn found them at the harbor, fully equipped and formed in ranks with the other legionaries bound for eastern postings. The morning air was crisp, the sea calm, and the omens favorable for sailing. With practiced efficiency, they boarded the vessel, stowed their equipment in the designated areas, and found their assigned spaces. As the ship's crew prepared to cast off, Marcus made his way to the deck for a final glimpse of Italian shores. The sun was rising over the hills, casting long shadows across the harbor and glinting off the white stone buildings of Ostia. He thought of his parents' farm, of the life he had left behind, of the uncertain future that awaited him across the vast expanse of Mare Nostrum. "Homesick already?" came Quintus's voice beside him. Marcus shook his head. "Not homesick, just aware. This is really happening. We're going to the other end of the empire." "To defend Roman soil is to defend Rome herself," Quintus quoted from some text or speech. "The frontier is wherever legionaries stand." The ship's timbers creaked as it pulled away from the dock, propelled by the practiced work of the rowers below and the wind filling the single large sail. Slowly, Ostia receded, the details of buildings and people blurring into a single mass of color against the green-brown backdrop of the Italian coast. By midday, land was a distant line on the horizon. By evening, it had vanished entirely, leaving nothing but the endless blue of the Mediterranean surrounding them in every direction. Their journey to the eastern frontier of the empire had truly begun. The voyage across the Mediterranean proved to be an education in itself. For men accustomed to the solidity of land beneath their feet and the regimented order of camp life, the uncertain motion of a ship at sea and the cramped conditions below decks required significant adjustment. Seasickness claimed most of them for the first few days, including Marcus, who spent miserable hours leaning over the ship's rail or curled in his hammock as his body rebelled against the constant motion. The experienced sailors showed little sympathy, though they did share remedies that helped somewhat, chewing mint leaves, focusing on the horizon, and small sips of watered wine. Gradually, they gained their sea legs and began to appreciate the rhythm of life aboard ship. The sailors, initially aloof, warmed to the legionaries once it became clear they were willing to learn and to help with simple tasks. In return, the soldiers shared their rations, which were often superior to the sailors' fare, creating an informal economy of food and small luxuries. Captain Demetrius proved to be more knowledgeable than his gruff manner suggested. In the evenings, when his duties allowed, he would sometimes join the legionaries on deck and point out the constellations by which he navigated, or explain the patterns of winds and currents that experienced sailors used to judge weather and plot their course. "The sea has its own language," he told them one clear night as they sailed past the island of Crete, its mountains a dark shadow against the star-filled sky. "Learn to read it, and it will carry you safely. Ignore it, and it will swallow you without remorse." Their route took them from Ostia eastward along the Italian coast, then across to Greece, past the Peloponnese, through the islands of the Aegean, and finally along the coast of Asia Minor before turning south toward the Levant. At each major port, Piraeus, Rhodes, Antioch, they stopped to take on fresh water and provisions, and occasionally to discharge or embark passengers or cargo. These stops provided welcome opportunities to stretch their legs on solid ground and to experience the diverse cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. Though all were part of the Roman Empire, each region maintained distinct customs, languages, and traditions beneath the veneer of Roman administration. In Piraeus, the port of Athens, Marcus and several comrades visited the ancient city, marveling at its monuments and the legacy of Greek culture that Rome had both conquered and absorbed. In Rhodes, they explored the marketplace, haggling for small souvenirs and sampling unfamiliar foods. In Antioch, one of the empire's great eastern cities, they were struck by the blend of Greek, Roman, and Syrian influences that created a vibrant, cosmopolitan atmosphere unlike anything they had experienced in Italia. Throughout the journey, Quintus served as an informal guide, his education allowing him to explain historical contexts and cultural nuances that would otherwise have been lost on his comrades. Even Drusus, usually dismissive of intellectual matters, found himself fascinated by Quintus's accounts of the Greek heroes who had sailed these same waters, or the great battles that had been fought on the shores they passed. The days settled into a pattern. Morning exercises to maintain their physical conditioning, inspection and maintenance of equipment to prevent rust from the salt air, informal instruction from veterans among the passengers, and leisure time spent in conversation, games of chance, or simply watching the ever-changing seascape. Bonds forged during training deepened during the voyage, as the shared experience of shipboard life created new levels of understanding and trust among the contubernium. 23 days after leaving Ostia, the lookout's cry announced their first sight of the coast of Judea. As they approached, the land revealed itself, a strip of fertile coastal plain backed by distant hills, with the white buildings of Caesarea Maritima gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Impressive, isn't it?" remarked a veteran who had joined them at the rail. "Herod the Great built it to rival the ports of Greece and Italia. The harbor is entirely artificial, breakwaters constructed by sinking huge blocks of concrete into the sea. A marvel of engineering." As they drew closer, the scale and ambition of the port became evident. A massive mole curved around the harbor, sheltering it from the Mediterranean's unpredictable moods. Warehouses, administrative buildings, and temples lined the waterfront, while behind them rose the city proper, dominated by a temple dedicated to Rome and Augustus that stood on a platform overlooking the sea. "And that," the veteran continued, pointing to a large building complex near the harbor, "is the Praetorium, headquarters of the governor and the provincial administration. Legio Kinx Fretensis maintains a permanent cohort here, though the bulk of the legion is stationed in Jerusalem and other key points throughout the province." They docked efficiently, welcomed by the practiced routines of a major military port. Within hours they were disembarked and formed up on the quayside, their sea voyage complete. A optio from Legio Tex Fretensis was waiting to receive them, checking names against a roster with bureaucratic precision. "Welcome to Judea," he announced without warmth once the administrative formalities were complete. "You are now part of Legio X Fretensis, the legion that bears the image of the boar and the worship in its insignia. Our motto is Fidelis et Constans, faithful and steadfast. You would do well to remember it." He surveyed the new arrivals with the critical eye of a veteran assessing raw material. "You will be quartered here in Caesarea tonight. Tomorrow you will begin the march to your permanent posting. Some of you will remain in Caesarea with the first cohort. Others will be assigned to Jerusalem or to smaller garrisons throughout the province." A collective tension ran through the group at this news. Their contubernium had been together since the beginning of training, forging bonds of friendship and trust. Now they faced the possibility of separation, of being dispersed among different cohorts or even different centuries within the Legion. The anxiety lingered as they were shown to their quarters, a section of the Legion's barracks within the city where they would spend their first night in this strange new land. The accommodations were familiar enough, the same standardized layout used in legionary barracks throughout the Empire, but the sounds, smells, and quality of light were all subtly different from what they had known in Italia. That evening, they were granted leave to explore the immediate vicinity of the barracks, though warned not to venture too far into the city. Caesarea was a predominantly Greek and Roman city, built by Herod to please his imperial patrons, but the surrounding countryside was primarily Jewish and Syrian, with complex tensions beneath the surface of Roman administrative control. Remember, you are representatives of Rome now, the Opsho had cautioned them. Conduct yourselves with dignity. Respect local customs where appropriate, but never compromise the authority of Rome. And never go anywhere alone. The province is generally peaceful, but there are elements who see a solitary legionary as a target rather than a peacekeeper. Marcus and his contubernium stayed together, exploring the broad colonnaded street that ran from the harbor to the city center. The architecture was familiar, the same Greco-Roman style found throughout the empire, but the population was more diverse than anything they had seen before. Greeks, Syrians, Jews, Egyptians, and others moved through the streets, their distinctive clothing and languages creating a tapestry of culture that emphasized just how far they had come from the relative homogeneity of Italia. It's like all the empire's peoples gathered in one place, observed Servius, his quiet voice filled with wonder. All under Roman peace, added Lucius proudly. This is what the legions make possible. Peace maintained by the thread of our swords, Gaius remarked, though without the cynicism that might have colored such a statement earlier in their journey. He, like the others, seemed genuinely impressed by this tangible evidence of Rome's civilizing influence. They purchased street food from vendors, unfamiliar dishes flavored with exotic spices that made their eyes water and their tongues burn, and sampled local wine, which was sweeter and heavier than the varieties common in Italia. As darkness fell, they made their way back to the barracks, minds full of new impressions and speculations about what their service in this distant province would entail. Morning brought the moment they had been anticipating and dreading, the announcement of their permanent assignments within the Legion. The same Opsho who had received them at the harbor now read from a wax tablet, listing names and postings with brisk efficiency. From the recent arrivals, the following men are assigned to the first cohort, remaining here in Caesarea under the direct command of the legate. A handful of names were called, but none from Marcus's contubernium. Next came assignments to the second and third cohorts, stationed in smaller cities along the coast. Again, their group was passed over. The following men are assigned to the fourth cohort, stationed in Jerusalem under Centurion Decius Paulinus. This time, the names included their entire contubernium, along with about 20 other new arrivals. A mixture of relief and apprehension washed through Marcus. Relief at remaining with his comrades, apprehension at being posted to Jerusalem, which every veteran they had spoken to had described as the most difficult assignment in the province. Jerusalem, whispered Titus beside him. The powder keg of Judea. At least we're together, Marcus replied, taking comfort in that fact. Whatever challenges awaited them in the holy city of the Jews, they would face them as a unit, drawing on the bonds formed during training and strengthened during their journey. The next day, they began the march to Jerusalem, joining a regular supply convoy that made the journey from the coast to the provincial capital. The route would take them eastward from the coastal plain, up into the Judean hills, climbing steadily to Jerusalem's elevated position, a journey of about 3 days at a legionary's marching pace. As they left Caesarea behind, following the well-maintained Roman road that connected the major cities of the province, Marcus felt the weight of the moment. He was no longer in training, no longer a recruit. He was a full legionary of Rome, marching to his first real posting, where he would begin the actual service for which he had been preparing these many months. The coastal plain was fertile and well cultivated, with olive groves, vineyards, and fields of grain stretching to the horizon. Villages and small towns appeared at regular intervals, their inhabitants pausing in their work to watch the legionaries pass. Some offered the traditional Roman salute, others simply stared with unreadable expressions, while a few, particularly those who were visibly Jewish, identified by their distinctive dress, turned away as if the sight of Roman soldiers was offensive. "They accept our protection, but resent our presence," commented the veteran Optio who led their convoy, noticing Marcus's attention to these reactions. "That's Judea for you, a land of contradictions." As they moved further inland, the landscape began to change. The lush coastal vegetation gave way to more rugged terrain, the road climbing into limestone hills terraced for agriculture, but inherently less fertile than the plains they had left behind. The settlements became smaller, more insular, more distinctly Jewish in character. "Notice how they build," Quintus pointed out as they passed through one such village. The houses face inward, presenting blank walls to the road. They live turned away from Rome, focused on their own community. "Can you blame them?" asked Gaius. "Their land has been conquered and occupied by a succession of empires. They've learned to protect what's theirs." The Optio, overhearing this exchange, fell back to join them. "It goes deeper than that," he said, his voice pitched for their ears alone. "The Jews believe this land was given to them by their God, that it's theirs by divine right. Every other people Rome has conquered has eventually accepted our gods alongside their own, but the Jews refuse. They believe their God is the only true God, which makes our presence not just a political occupation, but a religious offense." "Surely they can see the benefits of Roman rule?" Lucius asked. "Roads, aqueducts, stable governance." The Optio laughed without humor. "Try explaining that to a people who believe they're carrying out their God's will by resisting us. Physical benefits mean little compared to spiritual imperatives." He shook his head. "You'll understand better when you've been here a while. Just remember, in Jerusalem, everything is political and everything is religious, and the two can't be separated." The road continued to climb, winding through increasingly dramatic landscapes of deep valleys and rugged heights. By the end of the second day, they were high in the Judean hills, the air noticeably cooler and drier than the coast. They made camp at a way station maintained by the Legion, a fortified compound that provided security for travelers on the road between Caesarea and Jerusalem. On the morning of the third day, as they crested a final ridge, Jerusalem appeared before them, a city of white stone perched on a plateau, surrounded by valleys on 3 sides and dominated by an enormous temple complex that gleamed in the morning sun. Even from a distance, the scale and grandeur of the temple was apparent, its gold-adorned facade visible for miles. "The Temple of the Jews," the Optio informed them, allowing a brief halt to take in the view. The center of their world and the focus of their faith, built by Herod the Great to placate them, though they never fully accepted him as their king because of his Idumean origin and his loyalty to Rome. "It's magnificent," breathed Quintus, clearly impressed despite himself. Indeed, the Hopsho agreed, and therein lies part of the problem. The Jews believe their God literally dwells in that temple. Our very presence in their city is, to many of them, a sacrilege. He gestured for them to resume the march. The Fortress Antonia, where you'll be stationed, adjoins the temple complex. You'll have the best view in the city, and be right at the center of whatever trouble brews. Legio Kix Fretensis maintains 2 cohorts in Jerusalem, rotating duties between the fortress and the former palace of Herod, which now serves as the residence of the prefect when he's in the city. As they approached the city walls, the traffic on the road increased. Merchants with laden donkeys, pilgrims coming to worship at the temple, farmers bringing produce to the city markets. All moved aside for the legionaries, some with the practiced deference of those accustomed to Roman authority, others with visible reluctance or even resentment. They entered Jerusalem through one of its massive gates, passing beneath the watchful eyes of legionaries posted as guards. Immediately, the character of the city enveloped them. Narrow streets crowded with people, the sounds of multiple languages, the smell of unfamiliar spices and incense, the press of buildings that seemed to lean toward each other across the thoroughfares. Their route took them through the upper city, where Herodian and Roman architecture predominated, and into the vicinity of the Temple Mount. Here, the press of people was even greater. Pilgrims from across the Jewish diaspora, priests in distinctive garments, merchants selling sacrificial animals or exchanging foreign currency for the temple's own coinage. Finally, they arrived at the Fortress Antonia, a massive structure built by Herod to oversee the temple complex and serve as a military strongpoint within the city. Its towers loomed over the temple courts, allowing Roman observers to monitor activities in the sacred precincts below. A permanent garrison of legionaries maintained watch here, ready to respond quickly to any disturbance in the volatile temple area. As they marched into the fortress courtyard, Marcus caught his first close glimpse of the temple itself. Its white marble and gold ornamentation almost painfully brilliant in the midday sun. The scale of the complex was breathtaking. Massive courts surrounded by colonnades, rising in levels to the Holy of Holies at the center, where, according to Jewish belief, their God's presence dwelled. "Impressive, isn't it?" said a voice beside him. A centurion had approached while Marcus was distracted by the view. "You'll be seeing plenty of it. The temple is both the glory and the curse of this posting." "Sir?" Marcus replied, snapping to attention. "At ease, legionary. I'm Centurion Decius Paulinus, 4th cohort. You and your contubernium will be under my command." The centurion was a weathered man in his 40s, with the lean, hard look of a career soldier. His face bore the scars of old battles, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. "Welcome to Jerusalem, the most beautiful powder keg in the empire." As the new arrivals were shown to their quarters within the fortress and introduced to the routines of their posting, Marcus felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. They had arrived at last, at their assigned legion, at their posting, at the beginning of their true service to Rome. The years of training were behind them. The reality of life as a legionary in one of the empire's most challenging provinces now lay ahead. That night, from the rooftop of the fortress where off-duty legionaries gathered to escape the confines of the barracks, Marcus looked out over Jerusalem, the Temple Mount immediately below, the city spreading around it, the deep valleys and encircling hills beyond. In the distance, small lights twinkled, villages and isolated farms in the Judean countryside. Somewhere far beyond the sea they had crossed, lay Rome and Italia and his family's farm. For 16 years, this would be his world, this foreign city with with its ancient temple, its volatile population, its complex web of religious and political tensions. He was a Roman legionary in a distant province, a representative of imperial power in a land that had never fully reconciled itself to that power. Whatever came next, whatever duties, whatever dangers, whatever experiences awaited him, he would face them as a soldier of Rome, bound by his oath and supported by the comrades who stood beside him. With that thought, he turned away from the view and descended to the barracks, ready to begin his first full day as a legionary of the 10th Legion Fretensis in the troubled province of Judea. Life in Jerusalem quickly settled into a routine for Marcus and his contubernium, though it was a routine unlike anything they had expected during their training. Where they had prepared for pitched battles and frontier warfare, they found themselves instead engaged primarily in peacekeeping duties, maintaining order in a restive city that simmered with tensions both religious and political. Their duties rotated on a regular schedule. Some days were spent patrolling the city streets in small groups, a visible reminder of Roman authority. Others were dedicated to guard duty at key points: the fortress gates, the entrance to the prefect's residence, or the steps leading from the Fortress Antonia down to the temple courts. Still others involved escort duties for tax collectors, imperial couriers, or visiting officials. The most demanding assignment, both physically and mentally, was the temple watch. From platforms built into the walls of Fortress Antonia, legionaries observed the activities in the temple courts below, alert for any sign of disturbance among the thousands of worshippers who thronged the sacred precincts daily. During major festivals, when pilgrims flooded into Jerusalem from across the Jewish diaspora, the Legion maintained heightened vigilance, with additional cohorts brought in from other postings throughout the province. The temple is the heart of their identity, Centurion Paulinus explained during Marcus's first temple watch. Control it, and you control Jerusalem. But disrespect it, and you risk igniting the entire province. The centurion pointed to the vast court of the Gentiles, the outermost precinct of the temple where non-Jews were permitted to enter. See those inscriptions on the barrier? They warn that any Gentile passing beyond that point will be responsible for his own death. Even we respect that boundary, not because we believe in their God, but because keeping peace is more important than asserting our authority in every corner. This pragmatic approach characterized Roman rule in Judea. Where possible, the administration worked through local authorities: the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Religious Council, the temple priesthood, and the Herodian client kings who still governed portions of the region. Direct Roman intervention was reserved for matters affecting imperial interests: tax collection, major public disturbances, or challenges to Roman authority. For Marcus, this created a more complex operational environment than anything he had trained for. In battle, the enemy was clear, the objectives defined. In Jerusalem, determining friend from foe was rarely straightforward. The same people who peacefully conducted business with Romans by day might harbor zealots by night. A seemingly minor religious dispute could rapidly escalate into a riot requiring military intervention. You must learn to read the crowd, advised Flavius, a veteran opsho who had served in Jerusalem for 8 years. Watch for changes in movement patterns, for people clustering and speaking urgently, for sudden silences. The mood can shift in an instant, especially in the temple courts or near the praetorium during festivals. The complexity of their position was further illustrated by the strict rules governing their behavior while on duty in sensitive areas. Legionaries were forbidden to mock Jewish religious practices, to touch sacred objects, or to enter forbidden areas of the temple. When escorting Roman officials into the temple precinct, They were to maintain a respectful distance and minimize their presence as much as security allowed. "We're not here to provoke," Centurion Paulinus emphasized repeatedly. "Provocation leads to rebellion, and rebellion leads to bloodshed, theirs and ours. Remember that the finest victory is the one achieved without drawing your gladius." For men trained for warfare, this restrained approach required significant adjustment. Drusus, in particular, chafed at what he perceived as excessive caution. "We're soldiers, not nursemaids," he complained one evening as their contubernium gathered in the fortress barracks after a long day of city patrol. "Let them see Rome's strength, not her patience." "Rome's strength is in her patience," Quintus countered. "Why crush what you can control? A dead rebel pays no taxes." "Besides," added Gaius, who had developed a keen interest in local cultures during their time in Jerusalem, "the Jews are not like other peoples we've conquered. Their resistance isn't just to our rule, but to everything we represent. Their religion demands separation from Gentile practices, which makes assimilation nearly impossible." This reality became increasingly apparent as the months passed. While the Hellenized upper classes of Jerusalem, wealthy merchants, some priests, and those connected to the Herodian court, adopted aspects of Greco-Roman culture and cooperated with the Roman administration, the majority of the population maintained a careful distance, interacting with their occupiers only when necessary. "They see us as ritually unclean," explained a Jewish auxiliary attached to the legion as an interpreter. "It's nothing personal, it's their law. To maintain their covenant with their God, they must keep themselves separate from Gentile practices." This religious imperative created constant friction. Roman standards bearing images of the emperor, considered divine under imperial cult practices, were viewed as idolatrous by Jews. Roman coins with imperial portraits created similar issues. Even the aqueduct built by Pontius Pilate decades earlier, though providing practical benefits to the city, had sparked riots because it had been funded with temple money. For Marcus, these complexities were fascinating rather than frustrating. He had always been curious about the wider world, and Jerusalem offered a window into a culture entirely different from his own. During off-duty hours, he often walked the city streets, observing daily life and occasionally conversing with locals, whose Greek was sufficient for basic communication. "You're different from most Romans," remarked a Jewish shopkeeper with whom Marcus had established a cautious rapport after becoming a regular customer for the man's dried fruits. "You watch and listen more than you speak." "I'm still learning," Marcus replied simply. The shopkeeper nodded approvingly. "A wise approach in Jerusalem. This city has buried many who thought they understood it." As their first year of service progressed, Marcus and his contubernium adapted to the rhythms of their posting. They learned to navigate Jerusalem's labyrinthine streets without becoming lost, to recognize the various Jewish factions by their dress and manner, to anticipate potential trouble spots during festivals and Roman ceremonial occasions. They also learned to appreciate the small comforts available to legionaries stationed in a major provincial city. Unlike frontier postings, where amenities might be scarce, Jerusalem offered public baths, markets with diverse goods, taverns catering to Roman personnel, and even a small arena where wrestling matches and other entertainments were held. Their pay, while modest by civilian standards, provided for occasional indulgences beyond the basic necessities furnished by the legion. Some, like Titus, spent their denarii on local wines and the services of prostitutes in the lower city. Others, like Quintus, invested in books and writing materials, or sent portions of their pay home to families in Italia. Marcus followed his father's advice, saving most of his pay while allowing himself small expenditures on items of practical value. A finely woven wool cloak, better suited to Jerusalem's winter chill than his standard issue, a superior quality belt knife, occasional meals in the city's better taverns. He also purchased small gifts to send home when military couriers provided the opportunity. A carved olive wood box for his mother, spices unavailable in Italia for both parents. The contubernium remained a tight-knit unit, though individual members developed their own interests and associations within the broader cohort. Drusus found companions among the more aggressive legionaries who shared his frustration with peacekeeping duties. Gaius became friendly with several of the legion's Greek auxiliaries, furthering his interest in languages and local customs. Lucius, with his farming background, often discussed agricultural techniques with the legion's quartermasters, who were responsible for procuring supplies from the surrounding countryside. In their shared quarters, however, they maintained the close bonds forged during training and their journey to Judea. Their contubernium was increasingly recognized within the cohort for its efficiency and reliability, earning them favorable duty assignments and occasional commendations from Centurion Paulinus. "You 8 work well together," the centurion observed after they had successfully contained a dispute between Jewish merchants and Syrian traders that threatened to escalate into a broader conflict. "There's value in that, more than you might appreciate yet." The centurion's words proved prophetic during their second year in Jerusalem, when simmering tensions in the city began to boil over into more frequent and violent confrontations. The catalyst was a series of actions by the provincial procurator, Gessius Florus, whose corruption and provocative policies inflamed Jewish resentment. "Florus is a fool," muttered Centurion Paulinus after a particularly brutal tax collection operation had triggered riots in the lower city. "He squeezes them for immediate gain without thought for the consequences. A province should be maintained like an orchard, harvested sustainably, not stripped bare in a single season." For the legionaries, the deteriorating situation meant longer hours, more frequent deployments to trouble spots, and increasingly hostile encounters with the local population. Where once they had patrolled in pairs or small groups, they now moved in larger formations, fully armed and armored, rather than carrying only the standard peacetime gladius and dagger. The tension reached a critical point when Florus, in response to protests against his policies, ordered his troops to plunder the upper market of Jerusalem. The resulting violence left many citizens dead and triggered widespread rioting. The Jewish religious authorities struggled to maintain control, caught between the fury of their people and the ruthless response of the Roman administration. For Marcus and his contubernium, the crisis meant their first taste of serious combat. Assigned to secure a section of the city wall after reports that armed groups were attempting to seize control of strategic points, they found themselves confronted by a mob led by zealots, Jewish militants committed to violent resistance against Roman rule. "Hold formation," shouted Optio Flavius as the crowd surged toward their position, armed with a mixture of agricultural implements, daggers, and a few proper weapons. "Shield wall." The 8 men locked their scuda together, creating the defensive barrier that was the foundation of Roman infantry tactics. Behind them, a second section of legionaries prepared their pila, ready to launch the heavy javelins over the heads of the front rank. "Steady," the Optio cautioned as the mob approached, their faces contorted with rage, their voices raised in Hebrew battle cries that needed no translation. "Wait for the command." The distance closed rapidly. 50 paces, then 30, then 20. At the Optio's signal, the second rank launched their pila in a coordinated volley. The heavy javelins arced over the shield wall and plunged into the advancing crowd with devastating effect. Those not directly hit faltered, breaking the momentum of the charge. "Forward," ordered the Optio, and the shield wall advanced step by disciplined step. Gladi extended from behind the protective barrier of Scuda. The training that had been drilled into them for months now paid dividends. Each man moving in coordination with his comrades, each shield protecting not just its bearer, but the man to his left, each sword thrust precise and economical. The zealots fought with religious fervor, but little discipline. Individual courage was no match for the coordinated tactics of the legionaries. Within minutes, the momentum had shifted entirely. Those militants still able to flee did so, leaving their wounded and dead behind. In the sudden quiet that followed, Marcus became aware of his own rapid breathing and the trembling in his arms from the exertion of combat. Around him, his comrades looked similarly affected, faces flushed, eyes wide with the lingering intensity of battle. "Secure the wounded," ordered the Optio, his voice restoring their focus to immediate duties. "Establish a perimeter. This may be only the first wave." As they carried out these orders, Marcus caught Titus's eye. The burly legionary's face was spattered with blood. Whether his own or an opponent's wasn't clear. He gave Marcus a grim nod, a silent acknowledgement of what they had just experienced together. Their training had become reality. They had faced an enemy intent on killing them, and had prevailed through discipline and cohesion. That night, back in the relative safety of the fortress, the Contubernium processed their experience in different ways. Drusus was almost jubilant, relating his kills with relish and mimicking the expressions of fallen opponents. Servius, who had never shown much enthusiasm for the violent aspects of their profession, was quiet and withdrawn, responding to questions with minimal words. Quintus cleaned his equipment with methodical precision, his scholarly demeanor temporarily set aside. For Marcus, the aftermath brought complex emotions. There was pride in having performed well under pressure, relief at surviving unscathed, and a strange sense of fulfillment, not in the killing itself, but in having faced a true test of his training and resolve. Yet there was also disquiet. The faces of the men he had fought, some barely older than himself, haunted his thoughts. They had believed so fervently in their cause that they were willing to die for it, attacking trained legionaries with little hope of victory. "It's different, isn't it?" said Gaius quietly, joining Marcus on the rooftop where he had gone to find a moment of solitude. "Different from the training, from the exercises." Marcus nodded. They weren't barbarians or foreign enemies. They were citizens of the Empire, fighting against their own government. "That's what makes this posting so difficult," Gaius observed. "On the frontier, the line between Roman and barbarian is clear. Here, we're enforcing Roman rule over people who have never truly accepted it, who believe their god demands resistance." The riots eventually subsided, but the underlying tension remained. In the months that followed, security measures throughout Jerusalem intensified. Additional cohorts were brought in from other parts of the province, and the legion's presence became more overtly military, with regular displays of force intended to deter further unrest. For the legionaries, life took on a wartime rhythm, despite the absence of declared war. Off-duty hours were curtailed, training intensified, and constant vigilance became the norm, rather than the exception. Every religious festival, every public gathering, every visit by Roman officials became a potential flashpoint requiring military presence. By their third year in Jerusalem, Marcus and his Contubernium had experienced enough skirmishes and riot suppression actions to consider themselves blooded veterans rather than fresh recruits. The idealism that had characterized their early service had been tempered by reality, the complexity of maintaining imperial control over a population that fundamentally rejected Roman religious and cultural values. "You understand now, don't you?" Centurion Paulinus asked Marcus during a quiet moment on watch. "Why this posting is considered more challenging than facing Parthians or Germans? Because we're not just fighting men, but ideas." Marcus replied after consideration, "Beliefs that run deeper than loyalty to any earthly ruler." The centurion nodded approvingly. "Precisely. You can defeat an army, occupy a territory, extract taxes and tribute. But how do you conquer a faith, especially one that teaches its adherents that suffering for their God brings divine favor?" It was a question for which Marcus had no answer, nor, it seemed, did Rome herself. The empire that had absorbed countless local religions into its pantheon had met in Judaism a belief system resistant to such assimilation. The pragmatic tolerance that characterized Roman rule elsewhere found its limits in Jerusalem, where religious and political identity were inseparably intertwined. As tensions continued to simmer throughout Judea, Marcus found himself increasingly valued for his observational skills and measured approach. Where some legionaries saw only obstinate troublemakers, he recognized the complexity of the situation and the genuine religious convictions underlying much of the resistance to Roman authority. This perspective earned him additional responsibilities. Centurion Paulinus began assigning him to more sensitive duties, accompanying Roman officials meeting with Jewish religious authorities, serving as liaison with the temple guards during festivals, gathering information in the city markets where his quiet demeanor and respectful attitude made him less threatening than many of his comrades. "You have a diplomat's instincts in a soldier's body," the centurion observed after Marcus had successfully mediated a dispute between legionaries and temple officials regarding a security boundary, a rare combination and valuable in this posting. By the middle of their 4th year in Jerusalem, Marcus had been promoted to immune status, a legionary exempt from routine duties due to specialized skills. Though he remained part of his original contubernium for quartering purposes, his daily assignments increasingly separated him from his comrades, creating a subtle distance that both he and they felt but rarely discussed. This growing division within the once inseparable unit reflected broader patterns within the cohort. The pressures of service in Jerusalem affected different men in different ways. Some, like Drusus, became hardened and cynical, viewing the local population with undisguised contempt. Others, like Quintus, sought understanding through study, collecting local texts and consulting with educated Jews willing to explain their traditions. Gaius continued his exploration of local cultures, learning enough Hebrew and Aramaic for basic communication and developing relationships with merchants and craftsmen that provided valuable intelligence. Lucius maintained his steady, reliable approach to service, neither particularly sympathetic to the Jews nor hostile toward them, simply a professional soldier doing his duty. Titus, Servius, and Numerius followed their own paths as well, each finding ways to cope with the unique stresses of their posting. Some turned to drink during off-duty hours, others to gambling or brothels, still others to the philosophical discussions popular among the more educated legionaries. What bound them still was shared experience, the knowledge that each understood what the others had seen and done in service to Rome, the wordless communication possible only between men who have faced danger together. Their contubernium remained a refuge from the complexities of their duties, a place where they could speak freely without fear of misunderstanding or judgment. "We've changed," Marcus observed one evening as they gathered in their quarters, enjoying a rare night when all 8 were present together. all of us in different ways. That's what service does, replied Quintus, looking up from the scroll he was studying, a Greek translation of Jewish historical texts. It shapes us according to our natures, some more than others, Drusus remarked with a pointed glance at Marcus. Our friend here is practically going native. Next he'll be avoiding pork and observing Shabbat. There was an edge to his words that might once have led to tension, but after 4 years together, they knew each other too well for genuine offense. Marcus merely smiled and took a deliberate bite of the cured pork that formed part of their evening meal. Understanding isn't the same as converting, he said after swallowing. I'd rather know why they resist us than simply crack their heads for doing so. Knowledge is power, agreed Gaius, especially here. The conversation drifted to other topics. News from Rome carried by recent arrivals, speculation about future postings, reminiscences of their training days that already seemed to belong to a different lifetime. As the oil lamps burned low, Marcus looked around at these men who had become closer than brothers, bound by oaths and blood and shared hardship. Whatever the remaining years of their service might bring, whatever postings, whatever battles, whatever triumphs or tragedies awaited them, they would face it as legionaries of Rome, forged in the unique crucible of service in Jerusalem. They had entered the legion as boys seeking adventure or security or purpose. They would complete their service as men who had found all three, though not always in the ways they had expected. As he prepared for sleep, Marcus touched the wooden amulet of Mars his mother had given him before his departure, worn smooth by years of handling. 4 years completed, 12 to go. A quarter of his contracted service to Rome fulfilled, with the prime of his life still to be given to the eagles. It was a sobering thought, but not an unwelcome one. He had found his place in the great machinery of empire, his role in maintaining the Pax Romana that, for all its imperfections, had brought stability and civilization to much of the known world. Tomorrow would bring new duties, new challenges, perhaps new dangers. But that was the life he had chosen, the life of a Roman legionary, a life measured not in personal accomplishments, but in service to something greater than himself. With that thought, he drifted into sleep, lulled by the familiar sounds of the fortress and the rhythmic breathing of his comrades. The 5th year of their service in Judea brought escalating tensions throughout the province. Reports reached Jerusalem of clashes between Jews and Greeks in Caesarea, of bandit activity in the countryside that increasingly resembled organized rebellion, of radical preachers calling for divine deliverance from Roman rule. The atmosphere in the holy city itself grew more volatile, with minor incidents frequently spiraling into larger confrontations. In response, the legion's presence became more overtly militarized. Training intensified, with particular focus on urban combat tactics and riot suppression. Patrols were doubled, especially around the temple complex and other sensitive areas. Leave was curtailed, and legionaries were required to move about the city in larger groups, fully armed and armored at all times. Something's coming, Centurion Paulinus told his officers during a briefing that Marcus, now serving as the centurion's assistant in addition to his other duties, was present to witness. The signs are all there for those with eyes to see. The zealots are organizing, stockpiling weapons, establishing networks throughout the province. They're preparing for war. Surely they can't believe they could defeat Rome, objected one of the Optios. They have no army, no formal military training, no allies among the other provinces. They believe their God will intervene, the centurion replied gravely. That's more powerful than any rational assessment of their chances. Men who expect divine aid will attempt what seems impossible to others. His words proved prophetic. In the late summer of their 5th year, the simmering tensions erupted into open rebellion. The immediate catalyst was a decision by the temple authorities, under pressure from radical elements, to end the twice-daily sacrifice offered on behalf of the emperor, a ritual that had symbolized the Jews' acceptance of Roman authority, however reluctant. The provincial governor, perceiving this as open sedition, ordered punitive measures. In the chaos that followed, the carefully maintained balance between Roman pragmatism and Jewish religious sensibilities collapsed entirely. Armed groups seized control of the temple complex, killing the Roman guards stationed at its entrances. Simultaneously, rebel actions throughout Jerusalem targeted known Roman sympathizers among the Jewish population, creating an atmosphere of terror that silenced moderate voices. For Marcus and his contubernium, the outbreak of full rebellion meant a fundamental shift in their role. No longer peacekeepers in an uneasy city, they were now soldiers in hostile territory, fighting an enemy that blended with the civilian population and struck without warning. "This is what we trained for," Drusus declared with grim satisfaction as they prepared for an operation to secure a section of the lower city where rebels had established a stronghold. No more walking on eggshells around their precious sensibilities. "Remember, these are still citizens of the empire," Centurion Paulinus cautioned as the sentry formed up in the fortress courtyard. "Our objective is to restore order and Roman authority, not to punish the population. The majority of Jews have not joined the rebellion. They are caught between our forces and the zealots, and many fear the latter more than they fear us." The distinction became increasingly difficult to maintain as the conflict intensified. Urban warfare was nothing like the pitched battles they had trained for in Italia. It was close quarters, chaotic, and confused, with enemies appearing suddenly from alleyways or rooftops, striking, and then melting back into the civilian population. The legionaries adapted their tactics accordingly. They moved in tighter formations, secured buildings methodically from ground floor to roof, established clear fields of fire by demolishing structures that could provide cover for rebels. They learned to identify subtle signs of hostile presence: freshly disturbed roofing tiles, unusual patterns of shuttered windows, the absence of women and children in areas where families normally gathered. For Marcus, whose responsibilities now included intelligence gathering and assessment, the rebellion provided both professional challenges and personal conflicts. His understanding of local customs and his network of contacts among moderate Jews gave him insights that proved valuable to the Roman command. Yet he was acutely aware of the suffering caused by the conflict. Civilians caught in the crossfire, ancient neighborhoods reduced to rubble, the cultural treasures of Jerusalem damaged or destroyed in the fighting. "This didn't have to happen," lamented one of his Jewish contacts, a merchant who had advocated cooperation with Rome before the rebellion, but now feared retribution from both sides. If only cooler heads had prevailed, but the zealots gave them no chance. They eliminated any who counseled patience or negotiation. The merchant's words highlighted a bitter truth that Marcus had come to recognize. The rebellion was as much a civil conflict among Jews as it was a revolt against Rome. Various factions fought not only against the legions, but against each other, competing for control of the resistance and enforcing their particular visions of religious and political purity. As the conflict entered its second month, Rome's response escalated. Additional legionary forces were deployed from Syria, along with auxiliary units drawn from nearby provinces. The full might of Rome's military machine was being brought to bear on the rebellious province. With reinforcements came a change in strategy. Rather than attempting to secure the entire city simultaneously, The Roman forces focused on methodical clearance of Jerusalem sector by sector. Areas under Roman control were separated from rebel-held territory by walls and fortified checkpoints. Civilians were required to register with the authorities and carry identification documents. Those suspected of rebel sympathies were detained for questioning, with varying degrees of severity depending on the evidence against them. For Marcus's Contubernum, now functioning as a specialized urban combat unit under Optio Flavius's direct command, the new strategy meant a series of intense clearing operations. Moving building by building through designated sectors, they rooted out rebel fighters and secured territory for Roman control. It was during one such operation, in a densely built area near the city's northern wall, that they experienced their first significant casualties. Moving to secure a multi-story building that intelligence suggested housed a rebel command post, they encountered a carefully prepared ambush. "Clear the ground floor first," ordered Optio Flavius, following standard procedure. "Titus, Drusus, take point. Marcus, Gaius, cover the rear." The building appeared deserted, with signs of hasty evacuation. Personal belongings scattered about, food left half-eaten on tables. As they advanced toward the upper floors, the first indication of danger came from Quintus, whose scholarly attention to detail had saved them more than once. "The dust," he said sharply, pointing to the floor. "Disturbed recently, and there's a cloth caught in that trapdoor to the cellar." The warning came just as hidden rebels burst from concealed positions, not just from the cellar, but from behind false walls and from the upper floor. The ambush had been meticulously planned, with escape routes and firing positions prepared in advance. "Form up!" shouted the Optio, as the first volley of missiles, stones, crude arrows, and thrown knives rained down on them. "Shield wall!" They responded with the discipline that years of training and combat experience had ingrained, forming a defensive position with their shields, while returning fire with their pila. The enclosed space made their usual tactics difficult to execute, but the fundamental principles held: maintain cohesion, protect each other, create a stable position from which to counterattack. The fighting was brutal and intimate, often hand-to-hand in the confined spaces of the building's interior. Marcus found himself grappling with a rebel who had lunged at him from behind a doorway, the man's dagger seeking gaps in his armor, while Marcus struggled to bring his gladius to bear. They crashed against a wall, then to the floor, each fighting for leverage and advantage. Marcus's training made the difference. Where the rebel fought with desperate courage, Marcus fought with technique, using his weight effectively, controlling his opponent's weapon arm, finding the moment to strike with lethal precision. His gladius slid between the rebel's ribs, and the man's resistance ended with a choking gasp. Around him, similar struggles were unfolding. Titus had taken a knife to the thigh but continued fighting, his face contorted with pain and battle rage. Servius was down, blood pooling beneath him from a wound to the neck. Drusus and Lucius fought back to back, surrounded by rebels but holding their ground. The tide turned when Optio Flavius organized a push toward the main staircase, using their superior discipline to gain control of this critical point. From there, they were able to fight their way to the upper floor, where the rebel leaders were cornered. The final phase of the battle was swift and merciless. With their tactical advantage lost and their leaders killed or captured, the remaining rebels attempted to flee. Some were cut down as they ran, others were captured for interrogation. A few managed to escape through pre-planned routes into the warren of alleys beyond. In the aftermath, the Contubernum assessed their losses. Servius was dead, his life bled out on the dusty floor before a medicus could reach him. Titus was severely wounded, but would survive with proper treatment. Numerius had taken a blow to the head that left him dazed and confused. The others had sustained various minor injuries, cuts, bruises, sprains, but remained combat effective. As they carried Servius's body and the wounded Titus back to the fortress, a somber silence fell over the unit. They had faced death before, had killed before, but this was the first time one of their own had fallen. The abstract possibility of death that every legionary acknowledged had become concrete reality. That night, as they cleaned their equipment and treated their wounds, the absence of Servius was a palpable void in their quarters. His empty bunk, his neatly stored possessions, the space he should have occupied at their table, all served as stark reminders of the day's loss. "We should drink to his memory," suggested Lucius, producing a flask of decent wine he had been saving for a special occasion. A proper Roman tribute. They passed the flask in silence, each taking a sip and offering a brief word about their fallen comrade. Servius had been the quietest among them, a thoughtful presence whose calm reliability had balanced some of the more volatile personalities in the group. "He never wanted to be a soldier," recalled Gaius. "He told me once that he joined because his father insisted it would make a man of him. He was looking forward to completing his service and returning to his family's business in Ostia." "He died a legionary," Drusus said firmly, "with honor, facing the enemy. There are worse ends." Marcus said nothing, lost in his own thoughts. Servius's death had shaken him more deeply than he had expected. It was not just the loss of a comrade, but the sudden, visceral reminder of mortality, that any of them could meet the same fate at any moment. The wooden amulet of Mars seemed heavier against his chest, his mother's plea to return home more poignant than ever. The following days brought little respite. The rebellion had spread throughout Judea, with Roman forces engaged in suppression operations across the province. In Jerusalem, the fighting intensified as both sides committed fully to the conflict. The rebels, recognizing they could not match Roman military might in direct confrontation, increasingly turned to ambushes, night raids, and attacks on supply lines. For the legionaries, this meant constant vigilance and an ever-present sense of danger. Even in areas nominally under Roman control, threats lurked in shadows, behind walls, on rooftops. Trust, never abundant in Jerusalem, evaporated entirely. Every civilian was a potential informant or assassin. Every building a possible ambush site. Every seemingly routine patrol a potential death sentence. The psychological toll mounted alongside the physical dangers. Sleep became a luxury, often interrupted by alarms or nightmares. Appetites diminished as stress and exhaustion took their toll. Tempers frayed, with minor disagreements sometimes escalating into physical confrontations that required officer intervention.